You're listening to The Merging Life and Money Show, a podcast for thoughtful conversations about money, life, and the decisions that shape our future. In today's episode, host Marie-Jo Caesar revisits one of the earliest conversations from the show, planning for the future with retirement at the center, and updates it for today's changing landscape. This discussion is grounded in the U.S. retirement system and explores how evolving legislation, shifting guidance, and real-world pressures are influencing long-term planning. If you're navigating retirement decisions in an environment that feels louder and less predictable than it used to, this episode invites you to slow down and reconnect with clarity and perspective.
There is a particular kind of pressure that shows up when people start thinking seriously about the future. It is not panic and it is not ignorance. It is the pressure that comes from sensing that the ground is shifting while you are still trying to build something stable on it. That pressure has become louder over the past few years, especially around retirement. Not because people suddenly stop caring about planning, but because the rules that shape retirement decisions no longer feel fixed in the way they once did. Contribution limit change, withdrawal rules get adjusted, new ideas surface, gain traction, and sometimes disappear just as quickly. And in the middle of all that movement, people are expected to make decisions that will carry them for decades. What makes this moment particularly challenging is that retirement is not a short-term goal. It is not something you can easily correct once you are inside it. It is one of the longest, most expensive, and least flexible phases of life most people will ever plan for. When the environment around it starts to feel unstable, the instinct to act quickly can override the discipline to think clearly. Over the past few days alone, there has been renewed public discussion about retirement plan flexibility, including conversation around access to 401k funds for home purchases, ongoing implementation of the Secure 2.0 Act, updated IRAs guidance affecting retirement accounts, and broader proposals that touch housing, savings, and long-term security. Even when those conversations do not immediately translate into policy, they influence how people feel about their money. Possibility alone can create urgency, even when nothing has actually changed yet. This is where planning often starts to break down, not because people are careless, but because they are trying to plan in motion. They are responding to headlines instead of anchoring decisions in a long-term strategy. They are reacting to what might be available instead of revisiting what their retirement is actually meant to support. Now, if you've been listening to this show for a while, you know that this is not a new conversation for me. In fact, one of the earlier episodes I recorded years ago focused on planning for the future, with retirement at the center of that discussion. What has changed since then is not the importance of retirement planning, but the environment surrounding it. The landscape is noisier, the rules feel more fluid, and the emotional pull to do something has grown stronger. Well, for those of you who are new here, I am Marie-Jo Caesar, and this is the Merging Life and Money Show. I've spent decades working in global finance, and what I've learned over that time is that good planning is not about predicting the future perfectly. It's about building decisions that can hold their shape even as conditions change. Let me add this before we go any further. The legislative changes I'm talking about in this episode are specific to the United States retirement system. If you are listening from Bermuda or elsewhere, the rules in your jurisdictions will differ. But the underlying question, how to plan thoughtfully when the environment feels unstable, is universal. The principles hold regardless of geography. With that context in mind, it is also important to be clear about how this conversation is meant to be used. Everything we discuss today is educational. This is not financial advice, and nothing here should be interpreted as a recommendation for your specific situation. Retirement planning is personal. If you need guidance tailored to your circumstances, work with a qualified advisor who knows your full picture. Before we go any further, let me tell you how this conversation is going to unfold, because I want you to know exactly where we are headed. First, we are going to ground ourselves in what planning for retirement actually means when the future is long and uncertainty is real. Not retirement as a date or a finish line, but retirement as a phase of life that stretches over decades and require different kind of thinking. Then we are going to talk directly about the changes taking place in the retirement landscape that include legislative and regulatory shifts, like the continued rollout of the Secure 2.0 Act, updated IRS guidance that affects retirement accounts, renewed conversation around assets inside 401k plans, and newer proposals that touch housing and access. This exercise is not meant to analyze policy for its own sake, but to understand how these changes influence retirement decisions and behavior. And finally, we are going to look at how real life intersects with retirement planning. Housing pressure, family responsibilities, timing, and the quiet ways long-term plans get compromised by short-term needs. This is where many retirement plans unravel, not because of bad intention, but because the trade-offs are not always obvious in the moment. This episode is about planning for retirement when the rules are changing, without rushing, without ignoring reality, and without losing sight of the future you are actually trying to protect. With that framing in mind, the first thing we need to do is slow the conversation down enough to understand what we are actually planning for. Because retirement is often talked about as a destination, when in reality, it is a long stretch of life that requires a very different way of thinking. That distinction matters, especially when the environment around retirement feels uncertain. Let's start with addressing what planning for retirement really means when the future is long. One of the reasons retirement planning becomes so vulnerable during periods of change is that people underestimate just how long retirement actually is. We often talk about retirement as an event, as a date on a calendar, or as a milestone you cross. In reality, retirement is a multi-decade phase of life that unfolds slowly, with different needs emerging at different points along the way. When you plan for retirement, you are not just planning for the first few years after you stop working. You are planning for longevity, for health changes, for shifts in income, for evolving priorities, and for the possibility that what you want at 65 may look very different at 75 or 85. That long horizon is precisely what makes retirement planning sensitive to rule changes. Small adjustment, when compounded over time, can have outsized effects. When we say that retirement can last 20 or even 30 years, it's easy for that idea to remain abstract. Numbers alone don't always translate into lived experience. What often helps is imagining how time actually unfolds inside retirement, because the needs and pressures at different stages are not the same. The earlier years of retirement tend to feel full of possibility. There is usually more health, more energy, and a stronger sense of control. This is often when people travel, relocate, take on projects they postponed, or simply enjoy having more choice. Health and decisions made during this phase often feel reversible. Spending feels manageable, and flexibility feels abundant. But as time passes, the texture of retirement changes. Health needs can increase, energy can fluctuate, priority shifts. What once optional can become necessary. Expenses that were once occasional can become recurring. At that point, retirement planning stops being conceptual and becomes deeply practical. Later still, the focus often shifts again. Independence becomes central. Stability matters more than optimization. The ability to choose care, housing, and support without stress becomes one of the most valuable outcomes a retirement plan can provide. Decisions made such earlier, sometimes decades earlier, quietly shape what is possible at this stage. This is why retirement planning cannot be reduced to a single number or a single decision. A choice that feels reasonable at 60 can feel very different at 78. Access that feel empowering early on can become constraint later. What once felt like flexibility can quietly turn into fragility if it's not anchored to a long-term view. Planning for retirement then is less about predicting exactly what will happen and more about protecting future capacity. It is about building a plan that can absorb change without forcing difficult trade-offs later when there is less room to maneuver. This is also why retirement planning cannot be treated like other financial decisions. Short-term goals often allow for correction. If you make a less than ideal decision on a purchase or a 1-year saving goal, you usually have time to adjust. Retirement decisions, especially those involving tax-advantaged accounts, withdrawal, or irreversible choices, do not always offer that same flexibility. When legislation or regulation changes, it can alter the incentives around saving, around investing, or accessing funds. The Secure 2.0 Act, for example, introduced changes intended to expand access and encourage participation, particularly for people who were previously underserved by retirement systems. Those changes can be positive, but they also require interpretation. Expanded access does not automatically mean expanded security. The impact depends on how those options are used and whether they align with a long-term retirement strategy. This is where planning often gets confused with opportunity. A new rule or proposal can feel like an opening that needs to be acted on quickly. But planning for retirement is less about seizing every available option and more about understanding which options actually support the life you are building towards. Another challenge is that retirement planning rarely exists in isolation. It sits alongside housing decisions, career transitions, family responsibilities, and sometimes unexpected disruptions. When the rule governing retirement accounts shift, people may feel tempted to use retirement funds to solve problems that feel immediate and pressing without a clear framework. It becomes easy to justify decisions that feel reasonable now, but quietly undermine long-term security. What effective retirement planning requires, especially in a changing environment, is the ability to distinguish between flexibility and fragility. Flexibility allows you to adapt thoughtfully. Fragility pushes you to react defensively. The difference between the two is not access to information, it is clarity about purpose. When you are clear about what your retirement is meant to support, you are less likely to be pulled off course by every new proposal or headlines. You can evaluate changes calmly, understanding how they fit into your broader plan, rather than allowing them to dictate it. This is the foundation that makes the rest of the conversation possible. Without it, discussions about legislation, access, and alternatives become overwhelming. With it, those same discussions become inputs rather than triggers. Once you start viewing retirement as a long-term phase rather than a single event, it becomes easier to see why changes in the surrounding landscape matter so much. Planning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within rules, within systems, and within structures that shape what's possible. All of these changes we keep hearing about matter because retirement planning is governed by rules as much as it is by behavior. The structure of retirement accounts, the tax treatment of contributions and withdrawal, the limits that define how much you can save or access, and the types of investment that are permitted inside employees' plan, all influence outcomes over decades. When those rules shift, even modestly, they can affect how people plan, how they feel about their plans, and how confident they are in the decisions they've already made. This is why legislative and regulatory changes cannot be treated as background noise when it comes to retirement. They shape the environment in which planning happens, but they do not remove the responsibility to think long term. Over the past few years, and especially more recently, we've seen an increase in both actual changes and proposed changes affecting retirement accounts. The Secure 2.0 Act is a good example. Its intent is largely positive, expanding access, encouraging participation, and modernizing aspects of the retirement system. There are provisions designed to help people save earlier, save more consistently, and stay engaged with their retirement plans over time. But expanded access does not automatically translate into better outcomes. Flexibility can support good planning, or it can invite short-term decision-making if it's not paired with clarity. Retirement planning has always required interpretation. And as the rules become more complex, that need only increases. So what often gets overlooked in conversation about the Secure 2.0 Act is not what the legislation allows, but how those allowances are experienced by the people making decisions inside their retirement plans. Expanded flexibility can easily be interpreted as encouragement, even when the intent is simply to provide option. When new provisions are introduced, many people don't hear distinction. They hear relief. They hear that the rules are loosening, that access is easier, that restrictions are softening. In moments of financial or emotional pressure, that can translate into a sense that using retirement funds is not just possible, but reasonable. Employers and policymakers tend to view these changes from a structural lens, focusing on participation, portability, and long-term outcomes. Individuals experience them very differently. For many, the Secure 2.0 Act feels personal. It shows up as permission during moments of uncertainty, not as a technical adjustment to the retirement system. This gap between intent and interpretation matters. Retirement plans are designed to support future stability, but behavioral responses often prioritize present relief without context. Expanding choices can quietly accelerate decisions that undermine long-term resilience. Let me say that again. Without context, expanded choices can quietly accelerate decisions that undermine long-term resilience. The Secure 2.0 Act does not require people to act differently, but it does change the emotional environment in which decisions are made. This is why understanding not just what the law allows, but how it influences behavior is essential when planning for retirement in a shifting landscape. Along the Secure 2.0 Act, the IRS has continued to update guidance that affect how retirement accounts are defined, limited, and accessed. These updates matter because they clarify what is permissible, what is restricted, and how certain actions are treated from a tax and compliance standpoint. For individuals, this can influence decisions around distributions, rollovers, and timing. For those still working, it can affect how employer plans are designed and administered. What's important to understand is that these updates are not just technical, they influence behavior. So when people hear that rules are changing or being clarified, they often assume that action is required. Sometimes it is, often it is not. The challenge is that the emotional response usually arises before the practical understanding. There has also been renewed discussion at the federal level around expanding access to alternative assets within 401k plans. This is not an entirely new idea, by the way, but it has gained visibility again as part of a broader conversation about diversification, opportunity, and closing perceived gaps in traditional retirement investing. One thing that often gets overlooked in this conversation is the role of financial literacy. Expanding access to alternative investment assumes a level of understanding that many retirement plan participants have never been given the opportunity to develop. Alternative assets can behave very differently from traditional stocks and bonds. They may involve longer holding periods, less transparency, different fee structures, and risks that don't always show up the same way on a statement. Conversation around alternative assets in retirement plans is often framed as innovation or modernization. But what tends to receive far less attention is the level of understanding required to use these tools responsibly. Alternative investments behave very differently from the traditional assets most people associate with retirement accounts, and that difference matters. Many alternatives are less liquid. They may have longer time horizons, more complex valuation methods, and fewer transparent pricing signals. These characteristics are not inherently negative, but they do require a level of literacy that most retirement savers have never been asked to develop. When access expands faster than understanding, the risk is not just financial, it is behavioral. Retirement accounts are built around stability and predictability. They are meant to support a long phase of life, not short-term opportunity seeking. So when alternative assets are introduced without sufficient context, they can be mistaken for diversification when they are actually concentration, or for flexibility when they are in fact constraint. This is where financial literacy becomes essential, not as a checklist or a crash course, but as the ability to ask better questions. Questions about time horizon, liquidity needs, downside scenarios, and how an investment behaves under stress. Without that grounding, expanded access can quietly increase complexity inside accounts that were designed to reduce it. The issue is not whether alternatives belong in retirement plans. The issue is whether the people using them understand what they are trading off when they do. When access expands faster than education, the burden shifts quietly onto individuals to make sense of options they may not fully understand. That gap matters, especially in retirement accounts, where the margin for error narrows as time horizons shorten. Financial literacy is not about turning people into experts, but about ensuring they understand the trade-offs well enough to make decisions that align with their retirement timelines and tolerance for uncertainty. This is particularly important when policy conversations frame expanded access as opportunity. Opportunity without context can easily become pressure. Without a solid foundation of financial understanding, people may feel compelled to explore options simply because they are available or encouraged, rather than because they support a well-considered retirement strategy. For some investors, alternative assets may offer traditional diversification. For others, they introduce complexity, illiquidity, and risk that may not align with their retirement timeline or tolerance. The key point here is not whether alternative assets are good or bad. It's that expanding what is allowed inside a retirement plan changes the decision-making landscape. More choices require more discernment, not less.
You're listening to the Merging Life and Money Show. In today's episode, Marie-Jo Caesar is exploring what retirement planning asks of us when the rules are changing, not as a checklist, but as a set of decisions meant to hold over decades. This conversation looks beyond headlines to examine how expanded access, evolving guidance, and increasing complexity influence behavior, often quietly. As the episode continues, the focus shifts to how housing, family responsibilities, and timing intersect with retirement plans in ways many people don't anticipate, but eventually feel. Stay with us as the conversation moves from policy to lived experience.
Housing has also entered the retirement conversation recently, and in ways that reveal how quickly perception can shift. Just this past week, there was public discussion about allowing penalty-free withdrawal from 401k accounts for home down payments. The idea surfaced, gained attention, and was then walked back by the administration within days. It may never become policy at all. But even brief conversations like this matter because they change how people think about their retirement money. When housing affordability and retirement access appear in the same headline, the line between long-term security and immediate relief starts to blur. Retirement funds begin to feel less like future protection and more like available capital. What matters for planning is understanding that housing pressure and retirement security are not separate problems, even when they are addressed separately. Using retirement capital to solve housing challenges is still a retirement decision. The cost just shows up later, which is precisely what makes it feel manageable in the moment. One of the most subtle challenges in today's retirement environment is the effect of policy conversations themselves, even when they never result in lasting changes. Proposal announcements and public statements can influence behavior long before any rule is finalized, and sometimes long after it has quietly faded away. When headlines suggest that retirement funds may become easier to access, many people begin recalibrating their plans internally. They may delay decisions, accelerate others, or mentally reclassify retirement savings as a more flexible resource. This happens regardless of whether the proposal ultimately survives the legislative process. The result can be a kind of behavioral whiplash. People feel pulled between preserving long-term security and responding to what feels like an opening or opportunity. Even when a proposal is later clarified, revised, or abandoned, the emotional signal it sent often lingers. This is why retirement planning cannot be anchored to headlines. Policy discussions are important to follow, but they are not a plan. The danger lies not in staying informed, but in letting incomplete or temporary information drive permanent decisions. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why so many people feel unsettled about retirement right now. It's not just the rules that are changing. It's the pace and visibility of the conversation around them. This is where planning discipline matters most. Not every legislative proposal requires action. Not every rule changes the fundamentals of your retirement strategy. The danger lies in reacting to each development as if it demands an immediate response, rather than evaluating it within the context of your long-term goals. Retirement planning does not benefit from speed. It benefits from coherence. When decisions are made in response to headlines, they tend to be fragmented. When decisions are made in response to a clear plan, they are more likely to support long-term security. The purpose of naming these legislative and regulatory changes explicitly is not to overwhelm you. It is to ground the conversation in reality while reinforcing a critical point. The rules may evolve, but the need for thoughtful, integrated retirement planning does not. Understanding what is changing helps you ask better questions. It does not obligate you to act before you are ready. Understanding the rules and the changes shaping retirement planning is important, but it's only part of the picture. The real test of any plan shows up in everyday life, when theory meets pressure and long-term intention collide with immediate needs. That's where many retirement plans begin to shift, often without people realizing it. One of the most difficult aspects of retirement planning is that it rarely gets compromised by a single dramatic decision. More often, it weakens slowly through a series of choices that don't initially look like retirement decisions at all. This is where many well-intentioned plans begin to drift. Retirement planning exists in theory as a long-term exercise, but in real life, it sits alongside immediate responsibilities. Housing costs rise, family needs shift, careers change in ways that are not always planned. And when pressure builds, people naturally look for solutions that feels available and substantial. Retirement accounts often fall into that category. Housing is a particularly powerful example. It is emotional, visible, and tied to stability and identity. When affordability becomes strained, or when home ownership feels increasingly out of reach, retirement funds can start to feel like a resource rather than a reserve. Legislative conversations that touch housing and retirement at the same time only intensify that perception. Housing decisions carry a weight that goes far beyond numbers. For many people, housing represents safety, continuity, and identity all at once. It is not just where you live, it is where you feel anchored. That emotional weight is precisely why housing pressure can quietly override even well-constructed retirement plans. When housing feels threatened, retirement money can begin to feel less like future security and more like a resource meant to be used, not recklessly, but reasonably. The logic often sounds responsible in the moment. You are protecting stability. You are responding to rising costs. You are choosing certainty now over uncertainty later. What gets obscured is the fact that retirement savings are not just another pool of funds. They are time-bound capital. Once accessed, they are no longer compounding. Once redirected, they are no longer serving the original purpose they were designed for. The cost of that shift is rarely immediate, which is why it can feel deceptively manageable. Housing pressure also tends to arrive gradually. It might begin with higher interest rates, property taxes, insurance costs, or maintenance expenses. Over time, those pressures accumulate. At some point, the question shifts from optimization to preservation. People are no longer asking what is best. They are asking what will hold. This is where the long-term nature of retirement planning collides with very real present-day needs. Decisions made under housing pressure are rarely careless. They are often thoughtful, value-driven, and rooted in responsibility. But without a clear understanding of what is being traded off, they can quietly reshape the future in ways that are difficult to reverse. This is not an argument against using retirement funds when circumstances truly require it. It is a reminder that housing decisions and retirement decisions are inseparable, whether they are treated that way or not. Proposals that suggest greater flexibility around accessing retirement funds for housing are often rooted in real pain points. The challenge is not acknowledging those pressures. The challenge is recognizing that using retirement capital to solve housing problems is still a retirement decision, even when it doesn't feel like one in the moment. Once money leaves a retirement account, it stops doing the work it was designed to do. It stops compounding. It stops supporting future income. And unless it is replaced intentionally and quickly, the impact tends to widen over time rather than resolve itself. Family dynamics introduce another layer. Many people listening to this episode are not planning for themselves alone. They are supporting adult children, helping aging parents, or contributing to extended family needs. These responsibilities are meaningful and they are often unavoidable. But when retirement planning is not explicitly naming these decisions, trade-offs can happen quietly. Family pressures have a way of arriving all at once, even when they have been building for years. Adult children may still need support, whether financially, emotionally, or both. Aging parents may require care, coordination, or housing decisions that were never fully planned for. At the same time, careers may plateau, shift, or end earlier than expected. These overlapping timelines create what many people experience as a constant state of negotiation. In these moments, retirement savings often become the quiet backstop, not because people are careless, but because they are responsible, they are responding to real needs, they are trying to stabilize situations that feel urgent and deeply personal. Retirement money can feel like the most reliable option available, especially when other resources are limited or already stretched. So what makes this especially challenging is that the impact of this decision rarely shows up immediately. A withdrawal here, a loan there, a pause in contribution during a demanding season. None of these choices feels catastrophic on its own. Over time, however, they can create a form of slow leakage that reshapes the future more than people expect. Caregiving responsibilities, in particular, tend to disrupt long-term planning. They require flexibility, they require time, and they require an emotional energy, often at the same moment, when people are meant to be reinforcing their own financial foundation. Retirement planning during these years become less about growth and more about endurance. When family needs are addressed in isolation, retirement plans absorb the strain without acknowledgement. When they are considered together, trade-offs become visible. Decisions may still be difficult, but they are made with awareness rather than urgency. The goal is not to eliminate sacrifice. The goal is to ensure that sacrifice is intentional, proportionate, and aligned with the life you are trying to sustain over time. What often goes unspoken is that retirement planning is not just about having enough money. It's about preserving independence later in life. It's about reducing the likelihood that you will need financial support at a time when options may be limited and the cost of dependence emotionally and practically is much higher. This is where the intersection of legislative change and real-life pressure becomes especially important. Expanding access, increased flexibility, and new proposal can make retirement funds feel more usable in the present without a clear framework. That usability can blur boundaries that were once protected. Financial literacy help here, but literacy alone is not enough. Understanding how a withdrawal works or what a rule allows does not automatically answer whether a decision fits in the life you are planning for. That requires integration. Integration means seeing decision in context. It means understanding how housing, family support, timing, and retirement security interact, rather than treating them as separate problems with separate solutions. When decisions are integrated into the whole of your life, they tend to be easier to live with over time, even when they involve some level of sacrifice. This is also where restraint becomes a form of strength. Choosing not to act immediately does not mean ignoring reality. It means giving yourself enough space to evaluate whether a solution solves a short-term problem at the expense of a long-term one. Retirement planning is particularly vulnerable to the pressure of urgency because the consequences are delayed. The impact of today's choices often doesn't show up for years, sometimes decades. That delay can make it easier to justify decisions that feel necessary now but costly later. When the rules are changing and when conversations about access and flexibility are everywhere, the pressure to act can feel constant. But reacting to every development is not the same as adapting thoughtfully. Adaptation requires clarity about what you are protecting. This is why planning for retirement cannot be reduced to rules alone. It requires an understanding of your priorities, your timeline, and the role retirement plays in the life you want to sustain. Legislative changes may shape what is possible, but they do not define what is appropriate for you. The quiet work of retirement planning happens in these moments, in the pause before acting, in the willingness to ask what a decision truly costs, not just what it solves, and in the discipline to protect long-term security, even when short-term pressure feels compelling. That is how retirement plans hold their shape, even as the environment around them shifts. Before we bring this conversation to a close, it is worth pausing to reconnect the threads. We began by grounding ourselves in what retirement planning actually represents. Not a date or a single decision, but a long phase of life that unfolds over decades. When retirement is viewed this way, it becomes clear why reacting quickly to change can be more harmful than helpful. We then looked directly at the retirement landscape itself, legislative and regulatory developments, including the continued rollout of the Secure 2.0 Act, updated IRAs guideline, renewed discussion around alternative assets in retirement plans, and proposals tied to housing and access that are shaping how people think about their retirement money. These changes matter because they influence behavior, but they do not replace the need for clarity or long-term thinking. Finally, we explored how real-life pressures intersect with retirement planning, housing affordability, family responsibility, And timing often pulls on retirement capital without being named as retirement decisions. This is where long-term plans are most vulnerable, not because of poor intention, but because the trade-offs are not always obvious in the moment. With all of that in view, the question becomes how to plan for retirement thoughtfully when the rules are changing, without rushing and without losing sight of what the future is meant to support. There's a temptation, especially in time of change, to believe that good planning requires constant movement. That if the rules are shifting, the responsible response is to adjust immediately. But retirement planning has never worked that way. What sustains a retirement plan over time is not speed, it is coherence. It is the ability to make decisions that align with one another, even as circumstances evolve. Legislative changes may expand what is possible. They may introduce new options or clarify old ones, but they do not remove the responsibility to decide deliberately. One of the most successful reminders I've come across come from Warren Buffett, who once said, "The most important quality for an investor is temperament, not intellect." That insight applies just as strongly to retirement planning. Temperament allows you to pause, to evaluate, and to resist being pulled off course by noise of urgency. Planning for the future when the rules are changing is not about predicting every outcome. It's about building a framework that can absorb change without collapsing. When retirement decisions are made with that mindset, they are more likely to support stability, independence, and choice over the long term. And as you think about your own retirement planning, I encourage you to slow the conversation down, pay attention to what you are being asked to react to, and separate that from what actually requires a decision right now. Legislative changes, proposal, and new ideas can be important to understand without needing to act on them immediately. So take time to revisit what retirement means for you. Consider the timeline you are planning across, the role your retirement savings are meant to play, and how current decisions fit into that larger picture. If you are feeling pressure, that's often a signal to pause rather than push forward. Now, if this episode prompted questions or reflection, let that be the starting point. Seek clarity before action. Ask how each decision supports the future you are trying to protect, not just a problem you are trying to solve today. And if you need support navigating this conversation, whether around retirement planning, changing rules, or aligning decisions with long-term goals, don't hesitate to reach out or continue the dialogue in your own trusted circles. Before we close, I want to reiterate something important. This episode is provided for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing discussed here constitutes financial, legal, tax, or investment advice, nor should it be interpreted as recommendation or solicitation to take any specific action. Retirement planning is deeply personal, and your decisions should be based on your individual circumstances, your timeline, your risk tolerance, and your goals. If you need personalized guidance, please consult with qualified professionals, financial advisors, tax professionals, or estate planning attorneys who can evaluate your complete situation. And remember, that past performance is not indicative of future results, and all investment carry risks. Before you go, remember this. You are not behind and you are not late. You are planning in a world that is changing and that requires patience, discernment, and trust in your ability to adapt without losing direction. So keep choosing clarity over urgency and let your decision support the life you are building. You've been listening to the Merging Life and Money Show. I am your host, Marie-Jo César. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will be back next week. Until then, continue merging life and money.
You've been listening to the Merging Life and Money Show with Marie-Jo César. This episode explored retirement planning in a changing environment, with a focus on long-term clarity rather than short-term reaction. If this conversation resonated with you, you can find more episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. To learn more about Marie-Jo's work in financial stewardship and holistic financial wellness, visit mariejocaesar.com. Thank you for listening and for engaging with conversations that deserve care, patience, and perspective.